we're going to establish precisely what shock and hemorrhage mean for the human body at a fundamental level, how they fundamentally alter our physiology, and exactly how modern medicine attempts to reverse that collapse. Let's get straight to the facts. First up, we really need to redefine shock. It's often mistakenly thought of as just low blood pressure, but fundamentally, shock is a state of systemic tissue hypoperfusion. What that means is blood flow is so poor that it just can't support normal cellular breathing and metabolism. We have to look at this strictly as a cellular level failure. It's that exact moment when inadequate perfusion literally halts normal metabolic function across the entire body. To understand this, think about what happens inside a cell when that perfusion drops. In a healthy state with plenty of oxygen and glucose, a cell relies on aerobic metabolism to produce highly efficient ATP and carbon dioxide. But when you cut off that oxygen, the cell is forced to rely on glucose alone, completely shifting to anaerobic metabolism. Now, this only yields minimal ATP, and worse, it produces a highly toxic byproduct, lactic acid. When the oxygen is cut off, the consequence is a deadly domino effect. That ATP depletion triggers pump failures, causing the cell to literally digest itself and burst. And when it bursts, it releases a massive toxic wave of potassium right into the system.
Now, that single cellular failure, it doesn't happen in isolation. It actually triggers what we call the systemic collapse loop. Cellular ischemia and acidosis cause immediate endothelial damage and the release of oxygen-free radicals. This damages the blood vessels, leading to capillary leak and interstitial edema, which then drastically worsens tissue hypoxia, feeding right back into more ischemia. Meanwhile, the body is desperately trying to compensate. The cardiovascular system dumps catecholamines to drive a faster heart rate and clamp down on blood vessels. The respiratory system triggers tachypnea, rapid breathing, to blow off carbon dioxide, creating a compensatory alkalosis. And the renal system activates hormones like vasopressin to aggressively hold on to whatever fluid is left.
All of this rapidly builds into an acute crisis known as the lethal triad. Within minutes of severe injury, systemic hyperfibrinolysis, where the body rapidly breaks down its own clots, triggers acute traumatic coagulopathy. This traps the patient in a severe downward spiral of physiological exhaustion. The triad is made up of three interlocking factors. First, hypothermia, caused by cold, underperfused muscle and cold fluid transfusions, which actively reduces coagulation function. Second, acidosis, driven by that cellular hypoxia we just talked about, which inhibits the proteases needed for clotting. And third, coagulopathy, where active hemorrhage and fluid dilution completely deplete the body's native clotting factors. Each element accelerates the other two. It's a vicious cycle. So, to treat shock, we absolutely must pinpoint its origin. It generally falls into 5 classes. It could be hypovolemic, meaning a simple lack of fluid volume from bleeding, dehydration, or fluid shifting into tissues, or cardiogenic, where the heart pump itself fails from an infarction, a dysrhythmia, or blunt injury. Then there's obstructive shock, which is a mechanical block to cardiac filling, like fluid around the heart or a massive blood clot in the lungs. Fourth is distributive shock, characterized by severe vasodilation and maldistribution of microvascular flow. We typically see this in sepsis or anaphylaxis. And finally, endocrine shock, which is a disordered vascular responsiveness to catecholamines, like you'd see in adrenal insufficiency. How do we distinguish these clinically in a high-pressure environment like the trauma bay? If you break down the physiological parameters, hypovolemic, cardiogenic, and obstructive shock all share a low cardiac output and low mixed venous saturation. However, distributive shock is the clinical outlier here, because the core issue is profound vasodilation. The systemic vascular resistance, which is basically how tightly the blood vessels are squeezed, is incredibly low. To compensate for that, the heart actually pumps much harder. This results in a distinctly high cardiac output and an abnormally high mixed venous oxygen saturation. Let's track how a patient actively bleeding physically deteriorates through the 4 stages of decompensation. At the initial stage, with less than 15% blood loss, the patient is fully compensated. Central volume is preserved, and honestly, vital signs appear deceptively normal. Dropping to mild decompensation, with 15 to 30% loss, we start seeing a fast heart rate, rapid breathing, and cool peripheries, even though blood pressure is still maintained. The jump to moderate decompensation at 30 to 40% loss is the critical cliff edge where compensation completely breaks down. Renal mechanisms fail, urine output drops dangerously low, and frank hypotension finally kicks in. Over 40% loss, the patient enters severe decompensation with profound hypotension, zero urine output, unconsciousness, and labored respiration.
This brings us to a highly critical point. We need to dispel some really dangerous clinical myths regarding vital signs. Myth number 1, the idea that hypotension is an early sign of shock. The reality is that healthy adults maintain normal blood pressure via massive stroke volume increases until they've already lost 30 to 40% of their circulating volume. Myth 2, a fast heart rate is always present. The reality, tachycardia can be easily masked by beta blockers, pacemakers, or advanced stage. A pulse of 80 in a fit young adult is actually highly abnormal in this context. Myth 3, a slow heart rate rules out hemorrhagic shock. In reality, paradoxical bradycardia frequently occurs in young patients with penetrating trauma. And finally, delayed capillary refill is highly variable. In distributive shock, it can actually be naturally brisk despite profound tissue hyperperfusion. So, the absolute most crucial point here is summarized perfectly by a well-known clinical maxim. A patient in shock may no longer be bleeding. An actively bleeding patient may not yet be in shock. You simply cannot rely solely on the presence of visible blood or standard vital signs to determine the systemic crisis happening at the cellular level. When we're dealing with bleeding, understanding its timeline and type is paramount. Looking at the timeline, primary bleeding occurs immediately from the injury itself. Reactionary hemorrhage happens within 24 hours, usually because a clot dislodges or there's a technical failure in surgery. Secondary hemorrhage occurs 7 to 14 days later, typically driven by infection or pressure necrosis. There is also a critical management difference to note here. Surgical bleeding involves a direct vascular injury that requires mechanical control, like a ligature or packing. Non-surgical bleeding, on the other hand, is generalized oozing from raw surfaces due to coagulopathy. You can't just sew that shut. It requires immediate systemic medical correction. To actually diagnose if a patient is actively bleeding right in front of you, we use a fluid therapy test. You administer a fluid bolus and watch their response. A responder shows sustained improvement in blood pressure, meaning the bleeding is likely controlled. A transient responder shows temporary improvement that quickly drops again. This tells us their hemorrhage rate is lower than the volume being administered, so they require ongoing fluid and surgical control. And a non-responder shows absolutely no improvement in blood pressure. Their hemorrhage rate completely exceeds the fluid administration, meaning they require emergent, immediate surgical control. Historically, traditional resuscitation tried to forcefully restore normal blood pressure using massive volumes of clear crystalloid fluids. This was a deadly flaw because it actually popped formed clots and exacerbated the lethal triad. Today, the modern paradigm is damage control resuscitation, or DCR. For an actively bleeding patient, we allow permissive hypotension. We prioritize stopping the bleeding and fixing coagulation over achieving a normal blood pressure. But the very second that bleeding is mechanically controlled, our goals completely flip. We switch over to perfusion-targeted resuscitation, aiming to restore end-organ perfusion, clear the oxygen debt, and normalize the blood pressure. How do we actually perform that resuscitation? Well, pillars 3 and 4 of DCR strictly command the avoidance of dilutional coagulopathy. We completely avoid clear fluids. Instead, we use balanced regimes that approximate reconstructed whole blood. That means combining 1 unit of packed red blood cells, 1 unit of plasma, and 1 unit of platelets. Alongside this, we immediately administer empiric tranexamic acid, or TXA, to proactively halt clot breakdown and treat existing coagulation deficits. To monitor all of this safely, we have to move way beyond minimum standards like an ECG and hourly urine output. When running a central venous pressure dynamic challenge, a single CVP number is completely meaningless. What actually matters is the dynamic response after giving a 250 to 500 milliliter fluid bolus. If the line spikes high and stays there, the patient is facing volume overload and cardiac failure. If you see a normal sustained curve, that's a healthy response. But if the line barely blips and drops right back down, the patient is still empty and severely under-resuscitated. Even with excellent monitoring, there's a massive clinical blind spot you have to watch out for: occult hypoperfusion. This is incredibly important. Traditional vital signs like heart rate and blood pressure often return quickly to a normal baseline because they only monitor highly preserved central organs like the brain and the heart. So a patient might look completely stable on the monitor, but elevated markers like base deficit and serum lactate tell us their gut and muscle beds are silently suffocating. Clinically speaking, a base deficit greater than 6 millimoles per liter correlates directly with significantly higher mortality. To peer into that cellular environment, we decode the mixed venous oxygen saturation, or SVO2, which is measured via a right atrial central line. This tells us the balance between global oxygen delivery and cellular extraction. A normal range is about 50 to 70%. If it drops under 50%, it indicates inadequate oxygen delivery but maximal tissue extraction. That's the hallmark of classic hypovolemic or cardiogenic shock. But if it swings abnormally high, above 70%, it indicates disastrous microvascular shunting. The tissues are literally dying of hypoxia, but they're so damaged that they can't even extract the passing oxygen. This is the hallmark of distributive or septic shock. We are on a strict timer here. The ultimate endpoint of resuscitation is not just normal vital signs, it's the complete normalization of global perfusion markers. If occult hypoperfusion lasts for more than 12 hours, the risk skyrockets. Passing that 12-hour mark triggers a massive reperfusion injury when blood flow finally returns to those ischemic beds. This directly leads to multiple organ failure and causes a 2 to 3 times increase in surgical mortality. Now, while blood transfusion is absolutely essential to restore perfusion, we have to remember it comes with a severe immunological price. Heterologous blood transfusion directly increases morbidity in certain cohorts, so the rules are strict. If a patient's hemoglobin is under 6 grams per deciliter, there's a high likelihood of benefit and transfusion is strictly indicated. Between 6 and 8 grams, transfusion is unlikely to benefit unless there's active bleeding or impending major surgery. And if hemoglobin is over 8 grams per deciliter, there is absolutely no indication for transfusion in the absence of other specific risk factors. The immunological cost simply outweighs the benefit.
When we do transfuse, navigating the blood group systems is critical. Because Group O carries no antigens, it's our universal donor, while Group AB carries no naturally occurring antibodies, making it the universal recipient. We also have to consider the rhesus system, which is present in 85% of the UK population. For Rhd-negative patients exposed to Rhd-positive blood, they develop antibodies that risk severe complications in future pregnancies. Therefore, the emergency protocol is incredibly strict. When a 45-minute cross-match is impossible, we must use Group O-negative for females, while Group O-positive is acceptable for males. And exactly what are we transfusing? Let's quickly go through the blood component arsenal. First, packed red cells. Stored at 2 to 6 degrees Celsius for up to 5 weeks, these are used strictly to restore oxygen-carrying capacity. Second, fresh frozen plasma, or FFP. Stored at -40 degrees, this serves as the first-line therapy for coagulopathic hemorrhage. Third, cryoprecipitate. Extremely rich in fibrinogen and factor VIII, given specifically for low fibrinogen states. Fourth, platelets, kept at room temperature for just 5 days, essential for when a patient's platelet count plummets. And finally, prothrombin complex, containing factors 2, 9, and 10, used for the emergency reversal of warfarin in uncontrolled hemorrhage. But saving a life with massive transfusion introduces a profound paradox. While it's life-saving, it induces severe physiological derangement. Dilution of native clotting factors by component therapy causes further coagulopathy. The rapid infusion of massive volumes of refrigerated products directly exacerbates hypothermia. Citrate toxicity from the anticoagulant used in stored blood binds to the patient's serum calcium, causing dangerous hypocalcemia. And finally, the potassium shifting from cellular lysis inside the stored blood over time leads to life-threatening hyperkalemia or hypokalemia.